Hello everyone, today you join me in a car that I've been looking at for about a decade, but I've never actually even sat in and certainly not driven until now. I want to thank Neil for bringing down his 2001 7th generation Toyota Celica VVTL-i. Now for those of you viewing in the States, I believe this is what they called the GTS. And the important thing here is that it has the 190 horsepower 2ZZ motor, which is exactly the same engine that I used to have in my Elise 111R. Now, this is one of these cars, and I've changed my own opinion of it quite dramatically in the last few years. When I was in the market to buy one of these as one of my early cars, or one of my sort of first performance type cars, I looked at them, I loved the looks of them, the fact they're quite affordable, the fact they weren't going to be very expensive to run or to maintain, but I was put off by the 4 cylinders and by the fact they're front wheel drive. Now, as I've got older, basically, my opinion of front wheel drive cars and 4 cylinder cars has softened quite considerably. I now appreciate the fact that there is a time and a place for both. And therefore, I have brought this car on one of my favourite local tight, twisty, windy back roads, which is the sort of place where this car really should shine. Now, in terms of modifications, this car is fairly standard. Some of the boot has been stripped out, which means that it is now ludicrously practical. With the seats folded flat, you've got van-like storage space in there. Now, the other things that have changed are the wheels, which are aftermarket items, but actually look quite decent. And the exhaust. It's a custom-made catback system, which of course you can, I'm sure, hear, but there's no claimed performance gains or anything like that. Beyond that, the car is standard. Now, having spent a little bit of time looking at it this morning while we're taking photos and doing our exterior shots, I did notice one thing that I would certainly change, and I believe Neil is going to do soon, and that's the ride height. It rides ludicrously high. I mean, crazy high. You could take a good 25-30 mil out of the ride height and people would still think that it rode high. For me, that's all I would take out of it, because you still want to maintain a level of compliance, but it does look a little bit silly in the current setup. However, it does ride pretty well. These are not forgiving or well-paved roads, and it's taking them very, very nicely. I'm not pushing the car very hard at the moment, but it's perfectly pleasant. This car is reasonably light. Now, of course, I'm used to this engine in an even lighter car, in my Elise, but this weighs still less than 1,200 kilos. That's a very admirable number. From here, I actually feel much more like I'm driving a hot hatch than I do a sports car, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Visibility is very good. The controls are all actually quite natural. At no point in time have I really had to think about what I'm doing. Yes, the car has a fairly serious lack of torque, but that's okay. I'll deal with that in a moment. Now, one thing I was discussing with Neil this morning was the comparison of this engine to a VTEC motor. Now, I don't have masses of experience with VTEC motors, but I have driven a few. The thing I've always found quite interesting is that the internet would portray VTEC as this sort of instant light bulb thing that comes on much like a 2-stroke motorbike and gives you this sudden extra power. Now, it can sometimes sound like that, but I've generally found VTEC actually to be a fairly smooth changeover. These engines, however, are not. In my Elise, and I'll find out if it's the same with this in a moment, it's very much a distinct crossover point. Now, this car most likely is running Toyota's standard changeover, which is just over 6,000 RPM. My Elise had it set slightly lower at about 5.8. Let's see how it does. Yeah, it's 6.2 still. Now, I had a lot of people, when I did the EP3, tell me that I don't know how to drive these cars properly. Well, I do, it's just kind of annoying, because if I'm trying to do a review of a car and the engine's doing that all the time, Well, I think it gets a little bit tiring for you guys as much as it does for me. I mean, I can do the whole review this way if you guys want, but somehow I don't think you do. Now, the car is on winter tyres still, which obviously are not particularly appropriate for this weather. It is actually a very, very softly set up. I would say it needs a fair bit of stiffening. It pulls along nicely. It's not crazy fast. It certainly sounds a lot faster than it is, but there's plenty there. There's a lot to be said, and again, it's something I've changed my opinion on lately. 6 or 7 years ago, I probably would have turned my nose up at a car with only about 200 horsepower, but the truth of the matter is that on roads like this, in this car, the power figure is not the thing I'd be changing. It's definitely the suspension. It needs to be stiffened up quite a bit. The car definitely needs to be lowered. That's going to give you a lot better feedback and feel. The front end does seem a little bit soft. Of course, in my lease, the whole setup of the car is totally different. Different chassis, different everything, and the engine is in the back rather than in the front. Now, the winter tyres, of course, won't let the car grip as much as it could. I will say the steering is actually surprisingly good. I'm really quite impressed by it. Now, it sounds pretty nice, doesn't sound too bellowy or too buzzy. I mean, it's going to be louder than it normally would be, even with that exhaust, because of that stripped interior. But the thing with these cars is that for most people, like for Neil, not only are they probably going to be one of the first performance cars that you'll have, there's a very high likelihood that they might be your only car. And when that's the case, things like running costs and practicality and reliability, fuel economy, those become very, very important. It's all well and good for people with lots of money to go, oh, well, I'll buy this car, and oh, it doesn't matter that it does 20 to the gallon, I'm only going to drive it the weekends. Well, if this only did 20 to the gallon, that would be a pretty big problem. Now, they'll come at various ages, which in the UK means that they'll come under different tax brackets. This one, being a 2001, will come under a reasonably low tax bracket, and they do get a little bit more expensive, I believe, as they get older, but none of them are ridiculously expensive. It is actually, like, super comfy. I really didn't expect that. It's got this very, very Japanese interior, which is made up of leather-ish and grey plastic sort of everywhere, which is fine because it's a Jap car. Oh, Honda CRZ. Do not see those very often. My dad actually used to have one of them. The dials and gauges are all fairly clear and easy to read. The wheel is a decent size. Maybe you could do with being a little bit smaller, but then I have a preference for very, very small wheels. The Gearshift is pretty good. When one considers the fact that this is a 17-year-old car, it's quite impressive actually how well it's all held together. Everything in here still works. Aircon is blowing icy cold, which is very good on a day like today. You can certainly see the Supra lineage and influence in here. There's parts of the dash that feel very Supra-esque. Of course, there's no way that this car is like a Supra. It drives the wrong wheels, doesn't have enough power, etc., etc. But I think they look pretty awesome. I don't think these sold anywhere near as well enough as they deserve to. Why that would be, I couldn't say. I think it's probably the fact that they were just always outshone by their more famous stable mates from Honda. However, that may be a good thing for people wanting to buy them now because they are available seriously cheaply. Now, they weren't expensive cars to begin with, sort of depending on the spec and trim you bought, it's somewhere around the £20,000 mark. Now, I see examples of the VVTL-i, okay, with a few miles on, going for about £1,500. Really, really, really good examples of the much rarer GT, which had the Fast and Furious influenced body kit and a bit lowered suspension, a few other tarty bits. Wasn't actually any faster, just sort of mostly looked it. They only go for about £4 to £5 grand. So if you're looking to buy a great performance car that gives you good value, and you know you can't afford difficult or expensive to insure cars, this is a good shout. And insurance, of course, is important. Neil is only 21, so you can't buy at that age a difficult to insure car. Something like a Subaru Impreza is just not going to happen for most 21-year-olds. And it's the same for a lot of cars. Clio Sport 182s, 172s, that sort of thing. These cars gain a reputation, and that means they become very, very difficult to insure, basically because the other 21-year-olds have all put theirs into a hedge somewhere. These, however, because they're a little bit less appreciated, are, well, just that much cheaper to insure, and I think they're just as fun as a lot of other things. Now, of course, you won't have the massive selection of tuning and aftermarket parts that you get with, say, the equivalent Honda, you know, something like a TEG or an EP3, but you're also not likely to turn up at a car park in Essex and find 50 of them all parked in a line. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. I actually considered buying one of these as a daily runabout about 6 months ago. I nearly went and test drove one, and then I went and bought the Subaru instead, which in some ways was great and wonderful, and other ways really hasn't been. I think if I'm honest with myself, I probably spent more on maintaining the Subaru than I would have done on buying one of these. So that's, you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? So the car will do mid-30s to the gallon, obviously slightly more or less depending on how you're driving it, but that's a pretty respectable figure for a high-performance petrol car of this age. It feels like a nice place to be. I don't really know what more to say. I quite like it. You can see out of it. It should be reasonably hard to prang. I'm actually very impressed with it. I would definitely have one. It's got a little TRD, I say a little, it's got a massive TRD gear knob in it.
It's not real.
It's not real.
No.
There you go. It's got a massive fake TRD gear knob in it, but you know, hey, can't all have genuine TRD bits everywhere. They get kind of expensive. Car revs very keenly. There you go. And this is the only problem really with this engine, is that changeover point is so high, so high. If you don't change up at the very last second, if you change up anything before, you will drop out of the power band. But that then presents you a challenge. I suspect that's where many cars, certainly I think that's where S2000s and things wind up getting binned, because people spend so long trying to chase that power band, and they maybe leave the car on the power a little bit too long, go a little bit too deep into a corner and get things a little bit wrong. But otherwise, it's a very nice place to be. My only real criticism of it as a daily car, and one of the things that did sort of put me off a bit, is that just like the equivalent Honda, you're only doing about 20 mile an hour per 1,000 RPM in top gear. So cruising on the motorway, you're doing 3,500 RPM. And if you do have a Fuji exhaust, that can get a wee bit tiring. However, it's very easy to place on the road, very pleasing on the eye. This one's reasonably stealthy in black, but as a first performance car, I'd give it a big thumbs up. So there's a little short review, a little look at a somewhat forgotten Japanese car for you. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks again to Neil for bringing it down. And comment below, have you got one of these? If so, why? Tell us what you thought you were going to buy instead. And subscribe if you haven't. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.